We understand that there might be some folks that are joining us a little late. To be able to be respectful for everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to start off by telling everyone how much I appreciate the effort that has gone into this. My colleagues at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, especially from the Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, my colleagues from the Department of Defense, especially the support that we've received from the Defense Suicide Prevention Office, and of course, my very valued colleagues from the SAMHSA SMVF Technical Assistance Center who have assisted us with the coordination, the registration, and the opportunity to be able to have this conversation today. I also want to express special thanks to Mayor John Suthers from Colorado Springs and Director Michael Kilmer from the VA Eastern Colorado Healthcare System for both of their efforts to be able to invite community leaders to this very important event. And I would also like to express my thanks to BAV Services and KOAA 5 News, who are providing the technical support for our event today. For those of you who are attending the meeting in person or virtually as it were, we are also live streaming on the KOAA News 5 website, Facebook, and other platforms. And so to be able to understand that we will have community members joining us through the live stream, but we also are honored to be able to have the guests attending here in the meeting today. So to start off, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. The agenda here is on your left-hand side. We will here in a minute be hearing from Dr. Matthew Miller of the National Director for Suicide Prevention from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm going to give some overview of what we're looking like when it comes to suicide in the military affiliated population. My colleague Nicole will be talking about the collaborative. Then we'll be going into identifying some of the strategies that we can do as a community to address suicide in the military and veteran population. Talking about next steps, and we will have an opportunity at the end to be able to have a question and answer for anyone who may be able to or may have some questions or even comments. In the platform in the meeting, if you're a meeting attendee, we do have the opportunity for you to be able to view some more information about these 6 strategies to reduce suicide in the military and veteran population. If you are watching through the live stream, you have the ability to scan this if you have a smartphone, and you will be able to see the same 6 strategies to reduce service member, veteran, military family suicide. These strategies come with various links to different resources that you may be able to use, and we welcome the opportunity to have a conversation about these things. I would also like to, at the beginning and several times throughout this meeting, invite both the attendees of the meeting and those viewing online to take the pledge to prevent suicide for service members, veterans, and military families. My colleague Nicole will be talking about this a little bit more, but you'll be able to scan this link with your smartphone, and you'll be taken to the page where you will be able to take the pledge and publicly acknowledge that you want to be part of the solution to prevent suicide in the military and veteran population in our community. Now I would like to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Matthew Miller. Dr. Miller is the Director of Suicide Prevention Programs for the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, where he leads a team dedicated to the implementation and reinforcement of evidence-based community and clinical interventions addressing suicide prevention. Previously, he served as the director of the Veteran Crisis Line, and under his leadership, the Veteran Crisis Line became the world's largest and most efficient suicide crisis call center. Dr. Miller is an Air Force veteran. He served as clinical psychologist and the chief of mental health at Joint Services Pilot Training Wing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and was responsible for overseeing mental health operations for all active duty service members and dependents, as well as the head of the installation suicide prevention program. Dr. Miller?
Thanks, Dwayne. I am trying to think of the right words, and they sound cliche or trite, but they're not. I'm excited. I'm honored to be a part of this unique and admirable event that so many people have worked so hard to assemble, to organize, and now to engage. There are, I think, aspects of that sense of honor that I feel in being here today that are part of me. But more importantly, I think there are aspects of it that are a reflection of you. The part of me aspect, Wayne mentioned, as director of suicide prevention for the VA, I need you. I need you in the effort that I think is of eternal significance that we are currently engaged in with veteran suicide prevention. There's a reason why I have the vintage recruiting poster over my left shoulder. It's actually been in my bedroom since I was 7 years old, and now is in my office. But I reflect that same sentiment and need that I need you. Number two, as a veteran, myself, as a veteran who has experienced the death by suicide of a dear friend and colleague while we were serving together, I appreciate what you're doing. And that gets to the you aspect here. You are extremely unique. Just the fact that you're sitting here, you're extremely unique. And I cannot overstate how much I appreciate that. I spend some of my time talking to individuals and organizations about suicide, and then within that time, I find myself spending most of the time talking about the data and arguing validity of the data and answering questions about how it must not apply, or it must not capture things correctly, or it must be wrong, or it can't be that bad. I cannot tell you how refreshing it is to sit down with a group who is tackling this head on, and although I'm sure experiencing some of those defenses and fears and anxieties, choosing to acknowledge and recognize facts and say, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to pull together to do something about it? I admire that. I respect that. And I applaud it. It's an honor for me to be partnered with the Eastern Colorado VA healthcare system, Mr. Kilmer and his incredible team, and partnered with you in this. Now, what I want to talk about, and what we're going to talk about in depth and take various slices at it, is, so what is suicide prevention? We've worked past the defenses for the most part. They'll still come up. We've worked past the defenses. We're ready to punch this in the mouth. So what is that? What is suicide prevention? When I think of suicide prevention and I think of starting points, I think about a principle I learned in the military, and it was under the heading of broken arrow. It was when everything's going wrong, nothing's going according to plan, the facts don't look good. What do? What do you run to? What's the plan? What you run to during these times says a lot about who you are, what you believe in, and it also helps to serve as your guide and your anchor through and moving from those times. I think there's three anchors that we need to be collectively cemented in under the heading of suicide prevention. Number one, suicide is preventable. We know this on at least two levels. We know this on a clinical level. We know that when you look at data for veterans and suicide prevention, we know that engaging lethal means safety, particularly around firearms, saves lives. We know that when veterans are engaged in VHA care for depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder, we see a significant decrease from early 2000s to present in suicide rates in that group of veterans. Evidence-based care works, it makes a difference, suicide is preventable. We know on the population and community level, there are things that can be done under collective engagement that work, that help to prevent suicide. We see communities such as yours, when you pull together and when you pull in evidence-based practices together as a community, it creates outcomes in suicide prevention that are meaningful. Number two, I really believe suicide prevention is going to require a public health approach. So what does that really mean? I think when you say public health approach, it means you're looking at the issue across at least 4 planes and 3 dimensions within those 4 planes. One plane is the tools that you will implement from a public health approach. The 3 tools that you'll implement, at least 3 tools. You're going to implement policy, you're going to implement practice, and you're going to implement research and evaluation. Another plane is services. You're going to offer services that are prevention oriented. You're going to offer services that are intervention oriented. And you're going to offer services that are post-vention oriented. Another plane is population. You're going to attend to the needs of everyone in this plan. You're going to then attend to the unique needs of those who are at elevated risk, and you're going to attend to the needs of those who are at highest risk. And the services, the policies, the research that you do may differ according to those levels, those dimensions within the population plane. Finally, places. You're going to see yourself working in at least 3 different places. You're going to see yourself working in clinical or healthcare setting. You're going to see yourself working in the community, non-clinical setting. You're going to see yourself working even more personally and intimately in the home setting. A public health approach takes all of these, puts it together, and focuses them on suicide prevention as a whole. The third, I think, foundation is one that I think could be overlooked. Sounds a little bit like a cheer, but I would say it's the number one, and that is suicide prevention will require all of us. Suicide prevention is not just the work of the VA. It's definitely not just the work of Matt Miller. Suicide prevention is not just the work of medical or professional. Suicide prevention is all of us, and it's going to take all of us to combine to create disruptive innovation that brings about change. What you don't want to see is you got to be the right person, you got to have the right title, or you got to have the right relationship to have an idea in suicide prevention. What you're doing is the antithesis of that, and that's another reason why I love it. Everyone has a role to play, and you're bringing everyone in. Now, my final word will be something that ties this all together. In our nation, and the problem with suicide, we're not lacking intelligence, we're not lacking heart, we're not lacking motivation, we're not lacking willingness. When you take a look, though, then at rising rates and numbers, one thing that we could improve upon for sure is this concept, this principle called collective engagement. The more we're collectively engaged in pulling things together and heading in the same direction, the more we're going to see progress with regard to suicide prevention. So my hat's off to you for this demonstration of collective engagement. My hat's off to you for not running around the numbers, by the numbers, or from the numbers. My hat's off to you for saying and believing that suicide is preventable, that you're going to approach a complex issue from a complex perspective and plan, and you're going to do it with the entire community. Couldn't be happier to be here. So thank you. Look forward to diving into the schedule and the opportunities that we have to learn here together. Thanks, Dwayne.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have you welcome. So some of the things that Dr. Miller had mentioned are some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. And so first, to be able to understand what is happening, we need to be able to define what the problem is. And so really to get into some of the statistics, in Colorado, between 2004 and 2019, there have been over 3,200 service member and veteran deaths by suicide. This is based off of death certificate data. So the question on the death certificate is, has the decedent ever served in the armed forces? So that question is going to naturally capture currently serving military, active duty, guard, reserve, as well as service members and veterans. What that question isn't going to capture, it's not going to capture military family members, spouses, veteran spouses, military spouses, or their children. And it's also not necessarily going to capture questionable deaths, such as single vehicle accidents or drownings or questionable overdoses. And so really to think about this number, as large as it is, it's actually the tip of the iceberg in a number of different ways. 80% of all of those deaths occur in these 11 counties. These are the most populous counties. These are the counties with the largest veteran population. Now we're talking about the incidents, the numbers of deaths. We're not talking about suicide rates, which can be a little bit more of a different conversation. But 80%, the majority of the deaths by suicide in Colorado occur in these 11 counties. What this tells us is, yes, there are some concentrations of population, but also if we can implement some community interventions in some very localized area, we can do some different things, which is really why we're trying to have this conversation here in El Paso County. 20% of all of the service member and veteran deaths in Colorado occur in El Paso County. Over 650 deaths since 2004. The chart on the bottom shows the number of deaths year over year by suicide for service members and veterans. As you can see, in 2019, there were 57 deaths by suicide. In 2020, there were 55, negligibly, just about statistically the same. One of the things to put this into perspective, and I do some of this at the national level, I was having a conversation in February from a colleague in Louisiana. Louisiana, as a state, in 2018, lost 99 veterans. In 2018, we lost 48, more than half, and in a single community that other states do. So this is why we want to have this concentration, this information on suicide prevention, because it is such a significant issue in our community. To give you a little bit more understanding about this, we can look at the age breakdown. In El Paso County, it is distributed with the younger veterans and then with the older veterans. This is from 2020 specifically. The majority of them were currently married, not Hispanic, Caucasian. If we look at the age distribution, this is the age year over year from the age groups 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and then 55 and above. You can see that the green line there, the 35 to 54, has fluctuated. But in 2019 and 2020, we have been losing our younger veterans at a higher number than we have been previously. But overall, we're losing as many, if not more, older veterans than we are to suicide than we are to the other age groups. So you can see that I've highlighted years in which we've had over 15 deaths by suicide. Since 2012, the only year that we haven't had more than 15 deaths by suicide in the 55 and older age group is 2014, and it was just barely to that. However, you can see also in our younger veterans, 18 in 2015, over 20 in 2016, nearly 20 in 18, and then 29 in 2020. And so again, we really have to understand that in our community, we have to address this in a number of different ways with a number of different populations. Another significant a significant statistic that Dr. Miller had mentioned is the method of fatal injury. So in 2020, we lost 39 service members and veterans to suicide using a firearm, as opposed to 5 using poisoning, which includes overdoses, hanging and suffocation being 9. This again is a graphic representation of the number of suicide deaths we lost according to method of fatal injury. So that blue line, which you can see, the increasing line, the trend line upwards to that is firearms, whereas the green line is poisonings and the orange line is hanging and suffocations. The chart on the left, you see the number of suicide deaths using a firearm versus the total suicide death. The proportionality of that is anywhere from 50% to sometimes over 80%. And we see this nationally. We know that firearms are a lethal method of suicide, and Dr. Eric Wallace will be speaking to this a bit later. Also, by gender, our male veterans are dying by suicide more significantly. Again, looking at statistics, and we can really break down these statistics more. If our older veteran population, there are lower numbers of female veterans in our older veteran population. It doesn't mean that we're not concerned with one population or another, but digging into these statistics, and these are El Paso County statistics, not national statistics, not even statewide statistics, but these are statistics based on the number and the types of veterans that we're losing here. So I just want to be able to provide this as a basis, be more than happy to have this conversation with you or with your organization, as would any of the presenters. We're also able to show that the circumstances, toxicology and location of deaths by suicide. And so this is from the Colorado Suicide Data Dashboard on the left, the circumstances. You can see that veterans, 67.9% of veterans between 2004 and 2018 were identified as having a current depressed mood. That orange line is actually the state average, and so higher than the state average. Almost 35% had alcohol present, antidepressants presence higher in the veteran population than in the standard population. So these are the kind of this is the kind of information that we have related to the death by suicide. It's not the best information. It often is lagging in some significant ways by months or even years, which my colleague Lieutenant Cooper will also be talking about a little bit later. Now I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Nicole Johnston, who is the project manager for suicide prevention for the Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County, where Nicole will be talking about what the collaborative is and how we're trying to address this issue. Nicole?
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you for everyone for being here today. It shows your commitment to this important issue. I work for Community Health Partnership, which is an organization, a nonprofit that improves the health of the Pikes Peak region. And we use collaborative leadership that results in measurable improvement in health outcomes. We have 3 main programs centering around homelessness, substance abuse, and of course, suicide prevention, which I am the project manager of. We talked before with Dr. Miller about the importance of having collective engagement or collective impact. That's what we do with the Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County. One nonprofit, one business, one government cannot address these complex issues, but together as a collaborative, we can do this. And I did outline in this about what we do in terms of creating a space for idea generation. We seek funding, we coordinate, and I'll be going through the presentation today with more details. Next screen, please. We are part of the Colorado National Collaborative. We're actually one of 6 counties. Dwayne gave the statistics of El Paso County outlining the need. And what we work with is evidence-based strategies to reduce the rate of suicide. There are going to be other speakers who will be addressing this in more detail and specifically to veterans, but I wanted to give the visual of these pillars that we work around. Of course, economic stability, having the resources financially, economically, there's a link with that, and suicide prevention, connectedness, peer support, being connected to one another, either one-on-one or with our community, and access to safer suicide care, which we'll be discussing with our medical system. Lethal means safety. That's both with firearms as well as medications. Postvention, we have plans of what happens after a suicide occurs, but also tied into that is our prevention as well. And then of course, education and awareness. Around the circle, you can see the different special populations that we work with. And of course, today we will be focusing on military, but there's an intersectionality with all of these issues. Next slide, please. So again, we're part of this Colorado National Collaborative for Suicide Prevention. We do have all of these different partners that are listed below, including the Veterans Health Administration that is part of this today. We do get a grant from the Colorado Public Health and Environment Department with the Office of Suicide Prevention. And then of course we have EDC, CDC, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Next slide, please. Dwayne mentioned this in terms of the number of counties. Just wanted to have the visual of our local partners. We're able to exchange best practices, see what's working in one county or the other, and we meet regularly to exchange those ideas. Next slide, please. So what we're doing is, as I showed you before, we have these different pillars that we know are evidence-based strategies to reduce the rate of suicide. The Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County has over 60 different organizations that are part of the collaborative. And what we do is we have different work groups that works on these strategies. So I've listed them here for you. We have the postvention as, again, prevention. We do have service members, veterans, and military affiliated families. And we have, we have a little difficulty, but I can keep on going. We have the access to suicide safer care, data and evaluation. We want to look and exchange, have this free information of exchanging with our partners where we are with data so we can evaluate our effectiveness. Lethal means safety, education awareness. And then we also work with the county on youth suicide prevention. We are starting a new work group, which is for the LGBTQ+ community. Next slide, please. So we've had a lot of accomplishments in the last year. Despite everything that's happened with COVID, we had collaborative members do so much work. We obviously, we started with this call to action in 2020, and it really energized and mobilized the community. We'll be talking about our next steps of that call to action later on. We did form these work groups that I just went through. So we have active work groups that meet monthly to address these issues. We are communicating and coordinating, developing strategic action plans. We've secured additional funding to support our collaborative members. And then we also have educational campaigns, which we'll go through a little later, and Dr. Wallace will unveil. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We have some challenges. This is obviously a complex problem. We do have to collect data for the state data dashboard, always looking for information. It goes beyond just looking at deaths by suicide. Because we outlined the pillars before, we need to see where people are in terms of financial benefits and childcare, economic stability, connectedness, access to firearms. So that's the kind of data that we also are looking for. And language matters. We need to, if we're going to do this education and awareness, and we'll talk about this throughout the day, we don't want to say committed suicide. We want to say died of suicide. We don't want to say successful attempt. We'll say suicide death. So you don't want to say completed suicide, it's suicide. And we'll be sharing these resources, but that's something that's just simple that you all can adopt. Just one-on-one or also with your organizations. And of course, systems change is slow, but that's how we make meaningful impact. Next slide, please. So what's on the horizon? Well, we really focus on this collective impact of systems change. We are going to have this firearm safety campaign. Dwayne has gone through the statistics of deaths by suicide with our veteran community. It's overwhelmingly related to firearms. So we'll be going through that in more detail later on. We are going to be developing as a collaborative an equity plan to be infused throughout the collaborative and our work groups to really make sure that we're providing the most equitable plan for the collaborative. Zero suicide implementation. I know that the VA has taken a lot of these strategies, our healthcare system is, and as Dwayne had said, we find that a lot of people have sought medical care before there's been a death by suicide. And if we can get in before besides the screening for depression, but have more in-depth discussions and screenings on suicide prevention, we want to have all of our healthcare systems part of that, as well as our Veterans Administration and military healthcare facilities. And then, of course, prevention and postvention for school districts and employers of special populations that are high at risk. So that's what we'll be focusing on. How you can participate. We're always looking for data collection. I know it can be, sensitive. We don't want to put things out too prematurely. But like I said, if there's different data that can be helpful in terms of those different pillars, we're always looking for that so we can evaluate our effectiveness. I referred to language matters. I'm not just using that personally and individually, but as you're doing your own outreach and education, using that proper language. And then we have today, you'll see throughout, that prevention and postvention of signing the pledge publicly and committing to policies and processes to reduce suicide. And I'd like to thank you for your time. We have a lot more to go through today, and we appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Again, really feel like it's important to be able to understand that we are, in the last several years, we're trying to make a concentrated effort to address this issue, and Community Health Partnership and Nicole is really taking a lead on that. And so to go to the strategies, we've outlined 6 strategies that we would like to suggest to the community to be able to make a difference when it comes to suicide. And so the first strategy is what we're doing right now. Exhibiting the commitment from local leadership to coordinate efforts to end service member, veteran, and military family suicide. Our community does have a long history of identifying a social concern and then implementing strategies to be able to impact that. For example, in 2016, many of us remember that the teen suicide concerns here in El Paso County became national news. Newsweek did a part on did an article on the issue. And as you can see, in 2016, we did have a high of 15 teen suicide deaths. Again, this is non-military, but 15 to 19-year-olds. However, one of the things that we don't know, because we know we have a large military and veteran population, a significant number of these teen suicides are likely military affiliated, either as a veteran or even military families. And so what we did as a community is the El Paso County Department of Public Health actually instituted a teen suicide prevention working group that is actively working to address this population. Another example is my colleagues at Rocky Mountain Human Services and other homeless services providers since before 2015 have been working to end veteran homelessness in Colorado Springs. My colleague Allison Gerbig and her organization, Homes for All Vets, they have convened a community advisory council on veteran homelessness and has been doing this for about 6 or 7 years now. We have organizations like Freedom Springs, the Crawford House, Homeward Pikes Peak as they're developing the Commons, the Salvation Army Grant Per Diem program. These are plans that we have put into place that when we identify a concern in one social sector, that we've actually taken efforts and absolutely welcome the excellent efforts in the Pikes Peak Veteran Housing Fund that have really come out of executive and community leadership addressing these issues. Same with employment. When I retired from the Army in 2014, one of my first stops was our Military and Veterans Employment Expo. Again, ensuring that we have these concerns related to different aspects of military life, and then we convene partners like the Workforce Center, Hires Heroes USA, but also organizations here at home like Prep Connect 360 and Onward to Opportunity. Again, taking a leadership role to address a particular issue in our community. For those of us who were here in 2006, 2007, and 2008, we understand that there was a significant spike in justice-involved veterans. That was an issue identified in the community. And that was one of the impetus for Colorado to establish their first veteran court. So the 4th Judicial District Veteran Trauma Court in 2019 celebrated a 10-year anniversary of addressing the issue that was identified with the increasing number of justice-involved veterans. And 4th Judicial District has been identified as a national leader in the Veteran Trauma Court. It was selected as one of 4 mentor courts in which other courts would come in and learn what we're doing here. And so El Paso County has had a long history of identifying that there are some concerns, executive and community leadership chipping in and saying we need to do something about this, and then actually doing something about it. And we're asking that the same commitment be applied to service member veteran military suicide. So what are some of the ways that we can support? Take the pledge, as we were just talking about before. Engage with the Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County to develop policies, programs, and procedures to reduce suicide in your community, your system, or your organization. Partner with us to be able to address how some things are going to be done in your organization, and then engage collaboratively with other organizations following the guiding documents, the National Strategy to Prevent Veteran Suicide, Suicide Prevention Technical Package, and the DoD Strategy for Suicide Prevention. Once again, would definitely like to welcome, and we'll be asking this several times throughout this meeting, and even as we follow up afterwards, we ask that either if you're in the meeting as a leader in the community, please take this pledge to prevent suicide for service members, veterans, and their families. Or if you're watching this through the live stream, feel free to scan that. We'll be sharing this out in the community, but this is a public acknowledgement of being able to say, we're going to do something about this concern. Engage with the SPCO EPC to develop policies, programs, and procedures. Connect with Nicole as the program manager for the larger Suicide Prevention Collaborative. Connect with me to be able to address how we're doing this in the military and veteran population. And then engage collaboratively with other organizations. The VA's National Strategy to Prevent Veteran Suicide, the CDC's Suicide Prevention Technical Package, and the Department of Defense Strategy for Suicide Prevention are all taking a public health approach. And these organizations at the national level, how can we take what these different strategies and programs are and how can we apply them to our local community? Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Lieutenant Andrew Cooper of the Colorado Springs Fire Department to discuss identifying local circumstances of SMVF suicide. Coop?
Thanks, Dwayne. I appreciate that. So just once again to introduce myself again, I am with Colorado Springs Fire Department. I am a co-chair along with Cassandra and working with Nicole around the Suicide Prevention Collaborative. And when we start looking at this, and Dwayne has spoken a lot about some of the data points that we've already heard, we're talking a lot about the data that's available to us. And as we continue to move forward around trying to solve or reduce suicide in our community, we have to get, like Dr. Miller was talking about, is that disruptive innovation. And what does that mean for us, right? Is this really just thinking about different ways that we can approach what's available to us. And what we'd like to do as we move forward is not only understand the who's and the hows of suicide that's happening within our community, but we really want to dig into that why. Why is that happening? And that's much more of a psychological issue that presents, and that's a much more difficult thing to ascertain as we move forward. Excuse me, my phone. What we'd like to do is potentially start looking at some community partners, potentially look for some additional support funding around the coroner's office to see if we can get into much more psychological type autopsies around the deaths that occur in our community. So we can look at them from a different perspective and kind of dive into what are going to be the end results to be able to prevent this as we move forward. And then the other thing that we really need to do is build a stronger bond. So that's part of what this collaborative is attempting to do, is really bring all of the community partners together across the community of Colorado Springs, El Paso County, the military installations, and really kind of dig into how can we break down the barriers and the walls that we have established, or our silos around this information, and really open that up in a much broader way than we have in the past to really address the issues. So my challenge to you all is to think about that in different ways. Think about ways that we can evaluate the data we have and get new forms of data to kind of really dig into the whys of why this is happening amongst our community. That's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Coop. I appreciate that. The third strategy that we would like to propose is to increase and promote suicide prevention collaboration among military and veteran serving organizations. And while each of these strategies may be separate and distinct, they are linked together. So a couple of things, and you've heard it mentioned a couple of different times, but there's some things that we really want to get across to some individuals who are trying to do this work or just getting into this work. And first and foremost is that genuine connectedness saves lives. That means interpersonal connectedness, connecting individuals to each other, making sure they have the ability to reach out if they need some help. Connecting individuals to their community, to make sure that they feel like they're supported in their community, that they have the resources that are available from their community. Connecting individuals to resources that will help them overcome or even prevent suicidal crises, and then connect the community to the resources, because someone may come in contact with somebody in the community and have a need, but how do other community members get that individual to the right resources? Suicide is a complex issue that requires a coordinated community response, and every individual and organization has a role to play. So these are really the three main themes that we're trying to get across when we're talking about collaborative engagement. So you've heard us talk about the public health approach to suicide prevention. Dr. Miller kicked us off with identifying that, defining the problem. This is what Lieutenant Cooper was really talking about, is we have the data, but we need better data. The second step to a public health approach is identify risk and protective factors, then to develop and implement strategies. As we do in the military, and as I know that we do in the military and veteran space, a lot of times we go directly to number 3. We come up with a new program, we start a new strategy without really understanding how that strategy connects or coordinates with other things. So really what the Colorado National Collaborative is, that Nicole was talking about before, is identifying risk and protective factors. So we're choosing to focus on 3 protective factors: increasing connectedness. How do we ensure that our faith community is involved? How do we ensure that our military organizations that are providing peer support, our veteran service organizations, how do we connect them together and have them collaborate? Economic stability. A colleague of mine says it's very hard to think about your inner child if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight. So economic stability, housing stability, employment stability, financial stability, all has a significant role to play, that if we can get that in place, then we are preventing suicide. And then education and awareness, just what it is and what it means. All of these things, if we can get them in place in our community, then we can actually keep someone from getting into a suicidal crisis. However, if someone is in a suicidal crisis, we need to make sure that they have access to care. Many of us are aware of the bill that was just recently signed yesterday by Governor Polis to increase the ability to access to care in El Paso County specifically. That's a step forward. Dr. Wallace will be talking about lethal means safety here shortly, and then Cass will be talking a little bit about postvention as well. So this is what we need to do, that if somebody is in a suicidal crisis, then that crisis isn't fatal, that we're able to stop that from happening. This is the comprehensive approach that we want to take with the military and veteran organization. Again, suicide is preventable. It's very, very difficult to predict. It's hard to say whether someone who is experiencing a suicidal crisis at one point is going to die by suicide or not, or even if somebody who is depressed at one point may end up having a suicidal crisis or not. It's not as difficult, however, to prevent it if we put these things in place. Every organization, as I said, again, has a role to play. And every veteran serving organization in our community either meets these needs or has veterans with these needs. Again, my colleagues at the Veterans Court who can't be here today because they're having Veteran Court on Thursday afternoons, and I wasn't able to join them this afternoon. But they don't fit neatly in one of these 6 areas, but every single participant in Veterans Court needs these 6 things. So that's why we want to be able to say, how do we identify risk and protective factors and coordinate in a common way? And so it is an example of the coordination of these connected, or is these protective factors and these risk factors, an example of how this is mirrored in both the VA and the community. So for example, we have peer support specialists and we have peer support organizations like Objective Zero in the community. We have help for homeless veterans through the Healthcare for Homeless Veterans programs, the HUD-VASH vouchers, and we have SSVF grant providers in the community, such as Homes for All Veterans. The VA SAVE training, absolutely great. I talked to Edgar, Dr. Villarreal about this. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to bring SAVE training to the community. And then Cass is going to talk a little bit about QPR, the process of education and awareness in the community. Access to care, absolutely support and appreciate my colleagues in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the VA's Community Care Network also provides support to increase access to care. Lethal Means Safety, Suicide Firearm Toolkit, and then the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition. Again, these are some examples of different things that are both in the Department of Veterans Affairs and in the community. And the same for postvention. I feel that we are very, very lucky to have our partners with the Rocky Mountain MyRec here that provide a lot of resources, not just the suicide postvention, but also programs like Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors that does over 50% of their survivor families are as a result of suicide. So just an example of how we have in an organization like the VA and corresponding organizations in the community where we can coordinate to have these things. So a couple of different things that we have going on in our community. We've been participating in this Service Member Veteran Suicide Prevention Community Discussion Project. We're doing this to develop suggestions that will be discussed and implemented at future events that I'll be talking about here in a minute. We had the honor and even the privilege to be able to host the Medal of Honor recipient forum on suicide prevention. Some colleagues and I from Pueblo were able to participate, the Center of American Values, and my friend Matt Albright were able to host a multi-generational panel featuring Medal of Honor recipients Florent Groberg, a 4th ID hometown veteran, and Alan Lynch. Once again, feel free, if you're watching this, scan that QR code with your phone and you'll be sent to a link where you can actually view this. Some of the conversations that were discussed were stigma reduction, increasing help-seeking behavior, the importance of connectedness. It's approximately 1 hour long, but we welcome you to be able to use this for training, for awareness. We've had some conversations around individuals using this as a discussion, having their members watch this video, and then discussing some of the topics. And this is a potential series that will be continuing with the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. We are planning the 2nd annual El Paso County Suicide Prevention Summit. We had the first summit in January of 2020, as was mentioned before. This was a huge success. We had over 500 people attend both in person and virtually. And we plan on doing this every year for the next 5 years. And so stay tuned for this. We're currently planning for an event at the end of August in a very special place that Nicole won't let me talk about because we haven't confirmed it yet, but it's going to be pretty neat. UCCS was neat as well. But this is an opportunity for us as a community to gather together. But then also we're going to be hosting a suicide prevention forum for the for service members, veterans, and military families specifically. This is going to be a little later in the fall. This is going to be both hybrid, in person, and online, and welcome anybody to attend. We're going to have panel discussions from who have lived experience from both loss and attempt survivors, and then those examples of suicide prevention efforts in the community. We'll have roundtable discussions, and really the goal of this forum will be to establish a monthly suicide prevention meeting similar to what the El Paso County Department of Public Health has with their Teen Suicide Prevention Working Group. Now I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Cass, who will be talking about the next strategy, supporting widespread suicide prevention training for military and veteran support organizations. Cass?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you and so grateful that all of you are here with us. I am the Executive Director for Pikes Peak Suicide Prevention Partnership, and I serve as the Vice Chair for the Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about the pillar of prevention, education, and training. And I want to first acknowledge that I'm not going to tell you anything that you probably already don't know. I want to acknowledge that I am not the smartest person on this Zoom, and that I believe and hope that some of you are the smartest people on this Zoom. What I want is for us to figure out how to come together to take care of all of the people that we're responsible to take care of in this community. And when we talk about education and training, I think one of the most important things to talk about is how it just empowers us as individuals. When I talk to suicide loss survivors, or I attend a funeral, the most common things that I hear are, I had no idea that this person was even at risk for something like this. Or they might say something like, I knew something was going on, but I didn't really know what to do. And that feeling of helplessness becomes haunting to our suicide loss survivors. And then they themselves become at increased risk for suicide. And that is a vicious, vicious cycle that is completely preventable. And I think that we can work together to take care of some of that risk. Next slide, please. So when it comes to suicide prevention, there's so much education and training that we can be doing across all of the different components of suicide prevention. And so, you might be looking at the population that you're working with and saying, Cass, I can't teach them everything. By the time they come to me, they're already a grown person. And I understand that. And so I want to talk specifically about the trainings and education that we would provide as intervention. And so that's going to be QPR or Safe Talk, which are gatekeeper trainings. And I know that Dwayne talked about the SAVE training earlier, assist and calm. And so the assist training is just a little bit more in depth from a gatekeeper training. And, for some of you who may not know what gatekeeper is just anybody who could come in contact with someone who might be having thoughts of suicide. And what it does is it empowers those individuals to understand who might be at risk of suicide and what to do next. And when you look at a training like assist, this might be the person that I've identified as a gatekeeper. I'm worried about someone. And now I'm going to come talk to you and say, hey, I'm worried about this person. And you might be the individual who is more positioned to have that conversation with the individual who is having thoughts of suicide. And then the calm training, which is in regards to access to lethal means, which Dr. Wallace will be addressing later on. Next slide, please. When we talk about why we need increased training, well, for one, let me just tell you, I've been running around all of Colorado Springs and El Paso County talking to everybody about the need for training and the basic skills and facts that I think every responsible community member should have. But I do think that some of our military are especially at risk because of just the basic things that come with being part of the military. We know that some suicide risk factors include unwanted moves, exposure to trauma, loss of a loved one. This could be, in combat or because of that unwanted move, fear of different consequences. We get a lot of calls from spouses or partners, from young soldiers who have gotten into a little bit of trouble and they're really dealing with some guilt and shame, and that puts them at increased risk. Feelings of being a burden, and this is the most common thing that I hear from our veterans who are returning and are trying to, assimilate with the civilian community, not really feeling like they have a place and not understanding what their purpose is. And that goes hand in hand with that lack of belonging and that ability for lethality. So the act of dying by suicide takes a certain amount of thought process and ability to engage in that lethality with yourself. And, our military are exposed to a lot of things that can really put them in a different category when it comes to ability for lethality. Next slide, please. So when we think of, okay, we know these risk factors exist, we know what trainings would fit best in this area of suicide prevention, but why? What research tells us is that most individuals who are experiencing thoughts of suicide, they communicate that to someone in some way. Now, I'm not saying that they walk up to their friend and say, hey, I'm having thoughts of suicide. Can you please help me? That would be the ideal thing, but we know rarely happens. We know that they give some sort of sign or clue. And we also know that if we can use that time and we can identify them and create a window of prevention, if we can introduce some sort of intervention in that window, 90% of those individuals will go on to live. So what training does is it makes sure that we understand who may be at risk. And you would think that this is a simple concept, but because of stigma, because of different things portrayed in the media, a lot of times people don't understand that literally anyone could be at risk. It could be the person sitting next to you. It could be the person standing in front of you at the line in the commissary. It could be anyone. And so once they understand, okay, it's not just a specific demographic or type of person I need to be thinking about. I need to think about the risk factors that could impact anybody and everyone. And then now that I know who might be at risk and I am able to identify those risk factors, having the tools to understand what to do. It's not something that everyone is going to know how to do innately. And so giving them very basic strategies to be able to understand and practice is incredibly important so that they can feel effective in that role. And then finally, giving them that training to help them understand what resources are accessible. The other thing that comes to mind for me when I talk about accessible resources in the military is that there are a number of military resources that, because of stigma, some individuals are not willing to access. And we can't have that conversation. We can't address some of those perceptions unless we're put into a setting where that is part of the conversation. And so having these trainings where we're able to talk about, why is it that you are fearful of approaching this certain resource, then we can talk about that and we can start disputing some of those perceptions and helping increasing accessibility to some of the resources that some of you are working so hard to provide. Next slide, please. Let's talk about next who needs the training. So this has been my experience in both, the civilian community and the military community, where they say, Cass, we provide suicide prevention training. And the next thing that they say is, all of our leaders have it. All of the supervisors, they get their annual suicide prevention training. But I want you to think about when you are struggling, when something hard is happening in your life. Who do you turn to? Who do you talk to? Do you immediately go to your leadership, get really vulnerable with them, and tell them that something hard is happening in your life and you need help? Probably not. That's just not the way that we work as humans. So we need to look at people who are providing, administrative supports, bartenders, someone who might be at the gym, spouses. I get so many calls from spouses, your, chaplains and pastors and your healthcare workers, anybody who might come across someone in an everyday conversation and notice that something might be off with them. But what we need is for these kind of everyday folks to have the eyes to be able to identify some of those risk factors that are important. Next slide, please. The why in this for me is very simple, and I think that it is for all of you as well, and that's why we're all here today. Dwayne gave us a lot of statistics around it, but we're just losing too many of our military service members to death by suicide. When we think about being so proud as a country that we haven't had a lot of combat on our actual soil, I just really want you to think about, we are fighting something on our own soil, and it is this. This is something that we have the tools and resources to fight if we can just come together and provide people with the information and tools that we need to be able to successfully win this battle. Next slide. So, policies and procedures, protocols regarding education and training are just a component of what we would need to be able to really have effective suicide prevention. This is what we talk about, the collaborative is talking to all of our larger community about, specifically coming to you today to talk about. And so that education and training piece is just a piece of the needed ingredients for us to engage in effective suicide prevention. Next slide. that is what I have to say about the pillar of prevention of education and training. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cass. Trying to transition with the clicks. We really appreciate everybody being here to get this information. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Eric Wallace, Associate Dean of the Colorado Springs branch of the University of Colorado School of Medicine, to introduce Strategy 5, Support and Promote Lethal Means Safety Initiatives. Eric?
Great, thank you, Dwayne. We're about to show you a video, lethal means safety video. That's about 3 minutes long. And before we show you the video, which will be shown publicly for the first time today, I want to thank many people. So the Colorado Springs Firearm Safety Think Tank, which eventually evolved into the El Paso County Firearm Safety Work Group. This was a group of about 60 people who attended at least one time over the past 2.5 years, with a steady group of about 15 to 20 regular participants who worked on creating the video you're about to see, the script behind it, who should deliver the content of the video, and so forth. And we're also working on the distribution strategy. So within the next few weeks, this video will be more widely distributed throughout our community. Thanks to the coroner's office for not only the data that they provided, but allowing myself and several of our medical students to review all 332 charts of people who died by suicide in 2018 and 2019 to learn a little bit more about what happened and why. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Thanks to the Suicide Prevention Collaborative of El Paso County to pull together the people and the resources to help create this video. And also, very importantly, putting out doing a focus group of firearm owners to gather more information from the firearm owning community on top of the information we got from our firearm owning participants in our think tank and working groups. And thanks again, especially to the service members, veterans, and families who helped to protect our freedoms. So with that, Dwayne, go ahead and play our video.
Gun ownership, whether it be for protection, hunting, or sport, is part of our culture here in El Paso County.
We are proud to live and serve in this community where so many active duty military, first responders, and veterans protect our American values.
We support and protect your Second Amendment right to own firearms.
While we live in one of the best cities in the country, we are sad to know that too many people in our community are dying by suicide.
In fact, more residents die by suicide involving a firearm than from homicides and motor vehicle accidents combined. In addition, more people die by suicide using firearms than all other suicide methods combined.
Suicide is often a result of a temporary crisis, and once it passes, you or your loved one's risk of death by suicide drops dramatically. And a firearm is far more deadly than any other method used to attempt suicide.
Many people believe when someone who wants to die because of suicide will do so regardless whether or not they have access to a firearm. The truth is, 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide later in life.
In other words, people are much more likely to survive a suicide attempt if they do not have access to a firearm while in crisis.
The good news is that there are ways to protect your family. Suicide is preventable. As a community, we all have a responsibility to care for one another.
Do you know someone who is struggling?
Feeling hopeless, trapped, or in physical or emotional pain.
Are they increasing their alcohol or drug use?
If so, express your concern and ask directly if they're thinking about suicide.
Asking won't put the idea in their head. Listening to them and accepting their feelings without judgment can save their life. That might be all it takes to get them to the next steps of help and support.
Having conversations with your friends and loved ones about suicide includes talking about safe firearm storage.
Gun ownership, whether it be for protection or for sport, is your right as a citizen. With that comes responsibilities. It's our job to protect this community. We need your help.
Help us ensure the safety of your loved ones by storing firearms in a gun safe, keeping them locked, or storing them voluntarily and temporarily outside the home.
Remember, there is always hope. It's our duty as a community and citizens to help the people and each other that are struggling to find the light and find the hope. The following suicide prevention resources are available in our community. On behalf of all the first responders, we thank you.
And Dwayne, as you finish up the video here, on this screen, we have the resources for Colorado crisis, so text and phone number, and also the logos of all the partners, military, first responders, law enforcement who participated. This slide has some additional resources about voluntary and temporary firearm storage. So with that, I want to briefly recap the data that was presented there. So in El Paso County, we have more people who die by firearm suicide than homicides plus motor vehicle accidents combined. We have more people die by firearm suicide than all other suicide deaths by all other means combined. 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt don't die by suicide later in life. And that has to do with the type of means that are used. So medication overdose is the most common method or mean used to attempt suicide, but it has a case fatality rate of 2%. And what that means is that for every 100 people who attempt suicide by medication overdose, only 2 people will die. Hangings, which are the second most common method of suicide used for suicide death in El Paso County, has a fairly high case fatality rate of 56%, but firearms are at 90%, which means that 90 out of every 100 people who attempt suicide by firearm will die. So if people don't have access to highly lethal means, there's a greater chance they will survive a suicide attempt if they actually do attempt. And suicide is impulsive. So that thought of wanting to attempt suicide to actually attempting suicide occurs for most people over the course of just minutes to no more than a few hours. And if that can pass without access to highly lethal means, then you've also greatly reduced the chances that someone will die by suicide. Next slide. So some take-home points around conversations around suicide, around firearms and lethal means, and about how to do this is, number one, to talk with people who own firearms. You have to develop a trusting relationship. But when it comes to firearm conversations, there is tremendous distrust and skepticism when people raise that conversation about what the true motives are behind that conversation. And so in having those conversations, you want to make sure you emphasize the importance of people's individual rights, but also be able to talk about the responsibility of owning firearms and being able to store them safely. And language is critically important. I know Nicole alluded to this earlier. It's having a conversation that lets people know that you care, lets people know that you know what you're talking about, and that you're not here to grab guns and take them away. So talking about things that are voluntary and temporary and emphasizing individual choice is much more effective than talking about laws and mandates and things that you must do that contradicts the thoughts and feelings around the Second Amendment and your right to own firearms. Behavior change is really needed to make a difference, but behavior change is difficult. So as a physician, getting people to eat better, exercise more, stop smoking, drinking less, those conversations we have, but not everyone makes those changes or chooses to make those changes. And so getting people to think differently and act differently about how they act and behave with their firearm storage is a very, very difficult change to make. And so one way to approach that is to combine key data points with things that result in an emotional connection, because people only will change if it means something personal to them. And being able to share, not just share that data and assume that everyone's going to understand it and believe in it, but be open to questions and be open to having discussions around that data so that people feel more comfortable. And in terms of empowering people to make those changes, it's important to understand what the myths are. And one of the common myths that are out there is that people, again, if they don't have access to a gun and they want to die by suicide, they're going to die by suicide no matter what. And the fact is that that is not true. You can reduce the chances of someone dying by suicide if they don't have access to highly lethal means at that moment. You don't necessarily prevent them from attempting through other means, but you can reduce the risk of death. And you've heard before that suicide is preventable. From a medical standpoint, every human being is going to die of something. And although we're great at treating heart disease and stroke and Alzheimer's disease and a lot of different cancers, people will eventually die of those diseases and other diseases that are out there. But nobody has to die by suicide. Nobody. Next slide, and actually skip this slide, Dwayne, from a time standpoint. The final slide that I'll comment on, and this is a redacted slide. So this reflects my experience of going to the coroner's office and looking at charts of people who die and looking at pictures that were taken and putting myself in the shoes of a family member or friend who finds that family member or friend who has died by suicide. And it is devastating and tragic, no matter if they overdosed on a medication, if they hung themselves, but there's something different about dying by a firearm. It is violent, it is graphic, and I saw images that I can no longer unsee. They are burned in my brain forever. And to imagine myself finding someone I deeply care about who has died by firearm suicide and seeing the disfigurement, the blood, the brains, the skulls, the changes that go along from that violent means of death is just absolutely devastating. This is a redacted picture from a New England Journal of Medicine article, which reflects a person who tried to die by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, later died by other causes, but there's a picture in there that shows what happened to their face, and their face is gone. There is no distinguishable feature on that person's face, and they actually survive for a period of time. But to find someone like that is just devastating. And when in the meeting that was in January of 2020, I showed a blank slide, I talked about it, and I had someone come up to me afterward and said, I wish you had shown the picture, because my wife died by firearm suicide, my son died by firearm suicide, and I found them. And the images of what I saw, I will never leave my brain. And people need to see the devastation and destruction that come along with a firearm related suicide. But we did not show that today because we have a more general audience. It could be very triggering. We don't have the resources for support. But I did want to talk about the impact of it. For me, it was just looking at pictures, but for a lot of people in our community, this is something they see far too often, and we need to fix this. So with that, I'll come to an end and turn it back to Dwayne.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wallace. And so now, once again, I would like to share Cassandra, who will be talking about strategy 6, providing suicide loss survivor resources to all impacted by suicide. Cass?
Thanks, Dwayne. So first off, I just want to define postvention. It's not a term that everybody uses every day. And so postvention is simply the support provided following a suicide, death, or attempt. Next slide. There are 3 basic components to postvention, which include immediate support, ongoing suicide bereavement and support, and suicide prevention and education. And this really simplifies it because each of these basic components has some pretty complex things that need to be implemented with each of those things. Next slide, please. Postvention has to be proactive because there are so many different people who are impacted when there is a death by suicide or a suicide attempt. Research tells us that for every death by suicide, 115 people are impacted, with 1 in 5 reporting that they experienced a devastating effect or that it caused a major life disruption. So it's not something that you just want to be figuring out in the moment. And part of that and understanding that number is looking at the different levels of exposure. So if you look at the suicide exposed, that's the larger community. You know, that's like when my son or daughter sees that oh, that TikTok star has died by suicide, or there's been a recording artist, or someone in our community, I'm seeing it on the news. Then there's those who are a little bit closer. Maybe they lived in the same community, they went to the same church, or they somehow interacted with that person on kind of a passive level. And then the next level, the suicide bereaved for short term, those are the people who, immediately interacted with that person on a regular basis. And then that most intense bereaved long term, which are going to be the people who were closest to that individual who died or had the attempt. Next slide, please. So when Dwayne saw this slide, he was like, Cass, that slide is a mess. And it's meant to be, because you look at all those different people that are impacted. You look at the components of postvention and you think, man, that is overwhelming and complicated. And if we don't figure it out beforehand, if we're not proactive, that's a big mess that we're trying to work through in the moment. And I can tell you, working here at Pikes Peak Suicide Prevention, we are called on a lot to do postvention and to support postvention efforts. And the hardest cases are the ones where the only reason why it's being thought about is because tragedy has occurred. I recently had a first sergeant who was a member of my board, and he came to me and he said, Cass, I'm having to go and tell our team that this happened, and I don't know what to do next after I tell them. And then after that, I said, man, you seem like you're really impacted by this. How are you doing? What supports are in place for you? And he didn't have a real formal answer. And those are all parts of postvention that if we're proactive about it, we can absolutely plan for, support, and implement. Next slide, please. One of the things that we are doing in the community right now is we're creating loss teams, and that stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. And these are trained volunteers who respond when there is a death by suicide, and they provide that immediate support in the moment on the scene as close to the tragedy as possible to try and provide advocacy and help get the survivors linked up to the resources that they will need. And we know that the closer to the tragedy that we can have those responders be available to those survivors, the higher likelihood that they'll have a more positive outcome. And so in order to create a loss team, there needs to be a screening process and a training process for those loss volunteers, and then ongoing mental health support for your loss teams. So when you think about what current systems you have in place, you might have something that's on its way to being a loss team. Like that first sergeant, he was the one that was responsible for going to talk to the team. So in essence, he's kind of acting as your loss team volunteer, but without those other things in place, without being screened and trained, which help us to understand, is this going to be damaging for this individual to serve in this role? Do they have the tools and understanding necessary to do this effectively? And are we able to support them in an ongoing way, because we know that being this person and serving in this role can be traumatizing all on its own. Next slide, please. So postvention really requires community collaboration. And just like when I talked about education and training, and as we talk about suicide prevention, and as we're trying to get you to sign this pledge today, what I want you to realize is that we're not a group of people that are saying, here's something that we think you should do it on your own. What we're saying is, hear what we're saying and have that hard conversation with yourself in regards to your organization or your community. Do you have the necessary collaboration? What does it look like? And when you're thinking about, should we really partner with these folks? Ask yourself, can there be too much support? I really find a comparison to this with co-parenting, where you have the sense of protectiveness and ownership, and it's hard to let somebody else in. But what I would say is that there could never be too much support, especially if there's organized collaboration and everybody has an understanding of what their role is and what they're responsible for implementing. And then getting a consensus from the people that you're serving. Do they feel that the support that you're providing is effective? And what we learned in our community, and part of the reason why we have established this collaborative, is because our consensus was no, we're not doing a good job. Our collaboration is not effective. And we had to look at that, take that hard feedback, and answer it with action, which looked like creating this collaborative, coming together to collectively create responses, organize our resources, and implement them together. And that's really what we're hoping to do here, and really what will be required for anybody, community, organization, to implement postvention effectively. Thank you. You can skip that slide.
And so thank you so much. Thank you, Cass. Absolutely. We want to be able to provide some time to answer some questions to those who are attending the meeting today. Feel free to drop some questions in the chat or to try to use the raise your hand feature if that's something that you'd like to do. But we would like to be able to answer any questions you might have. You have the contact information both in the meeting agenda platform as well as here on the slide. But we'd like to also invite you to join us in taking the pledge to prevent suicide for service members, veterans, and their families. Again, we have these 6 strategies, right? Taking a leadership role in our community to be able to stand up and say, we need to be able to address this in our organization, within our particular aspect of the community, that we want to increase and promote suicide prevention collaboration among veteran serving organizations, that we want to increase and encourage suicide prevention training for all military and veteran organizations at all levels, supporting and promoting lethal means safety initiatives, and contributing to efforts to prevent suicide loss, survivor resources to all impacted by suicide. We want to invite you to join us. We are looking to build this collaboration. We're looking to build the collaborative to be able to reduce suicide. And one of the conversations that we have is not just in the military and veteran population. As service members go, as the military goes, we know so goes our nation. This was the case when we were trying to address homelessness at large in the community, but also focusing on the military and veteran population. By our conversation here today around the military and veteran population, we're not saying that we're not concerned about the suicide deaths not in the military and veteran population. Those even outstrip those that are in the military and veteran population. Here, we're just partnering with our colleagues in the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs to specifically tackle this population. And if we can have some resources and some processes that work here, that we can apply that to the wider population. Thank you, Nicole, for dropping the pledge to prevent suicide in the chat. Colleagues, attendees, once again, I thank you for joining us. We do have about 5 minutes. I think we have the ability to sort of linger a little bit. If you have any questions, we would love to hear them. Whether you want to speak them out loud or you want to share them in the chat.